Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Soverign's Bite is possibly Pauper Playable. The focus of this series is to highlight newly released cards as they enter the Pauper format to see whether they're going to be playable or not. So I'm always really excited to see 5-0 lists pop up featuring a new card like this black-red burn deck by Tominous. It features Soverign's Bite, a card that some people are referring to as Pauper's Lightning Helix. Soverign's Bite costs 1 and a black for sorcery that causes target player to lose 3 life and allows you to gain 3 life. Black burn spells are uniquely powerful because they almost always come with a little bit of life gain attached. That's very relevant because there are a lot of decks in the Pauper metagame that are incredibly fast. A few extra life points go a long way. Because we're going to be gaining life off of our black burn spells, it makes this next spell a little bit less risky to run as well. This is called Flame Rift. It costs 1 and a red for a sorcery that deals 4 damage to each player. When mono red burn lists are running Flame Rift against an aggressive deck, you almost always have to ask yourself if that extra 4 points of life is going to matter. In black red burn, we can assure ourselves that we'll gain that life back, so it's a little bit easier to cast. While Tominous's deck is a unique take on the burn archetype, it's still running a lot of the typical spells you'd see in a mono red burn deck. I'm going to go over those spells next. First, we have Chain Lightning, which costs 1 red mana for a sorcery that deals 3 damage to any target. Then, that player or that permanent's controller may pay red. If the player does, they may copy the spell and may choose a new target for that copy. Most of the time, Chain Lightning is just a very efficient burn spell. For 1 mana, you deal 3 damage to your opponent, but if they're feeling frisky, they might pay 2 red and send it back at you. Usually you're ready to send it back again, turning this into a 3 mana, 6 damage burn spell, but that doesn't come up very often. We're also running Lava Spike, which costs 1 red mana for a sorcery that deals 3 damage to target player or planeswalker, just another very efficient burn spell. Of course, we're running 4 copies of Lightning Bolt, the best burn spell in the format. It costs 1 red mana to deal 3 damage to any target at instant speed. Our last typical red burn spell is Rift Bolt. It costs 2 and a red to deal 3 damage to any target at sorcery speed. What makes it really cool is that it has Suspend 1. Suspend 1 means you can pay 1 red and exile Rift Bolt with a time counter on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter from Rift Bolt. When the last is removed, cast Rift Bolt without paying its mana cost. Even though it does take an extra turn, Rift Bolt does still turn out to be another 3 damage burn spell for 1 red mana, and it's pretty cool that it's free on the turn you cast it because it helps you play multiple spells in a turn, hedging for your opponent having a lot of counter magic. Our next set of spells actually allow your opponent a bit of agency in what happens when they resolve, something Magic players refer to as a Punisher mechanic. First, we have Tyrant's Choice, which costs 1 and a black for a sorcery, and it has the Will of the Council ability, which means starting with you, each player votes for death or torture. If death gets more votes, each opponent sacrifices a creature. If torture gets more votes or the vote is tied, each opponent loses 4 life. Tyrant's Choice was printed in a conspiracy set, which means it was meant to be cast in a multiplayer game. That way, there would be a lot of votes for its Will of the Council ability. In our deck, however, Tyrant's Choice will almost never be the Edict effect. It will almost always just cause our opponent to lose 4 life. We're also running 2 copies of the very interesting Ristic Lightning. It costs 2 and a red for an instant that deals 4 damage to any target unless that permanent's controller or that player pays 2 generic mana. If they do, Ristic Lightning deals 2 damage to that permanent or player instead. I think it's great that Ristic Lightning can sometimes deal 4 damage if we leverage it properly. However, because it's instant speed, it's not a disaster to play this on your opponent's end step and get them to tap a little bit more mana so that you can have a productive next turn. Next, I'm going to talk about the kind of cool and synergistic discard package that's included in this deck. I'm pretty sure Tominous used it to maximize some black burn spells, but at the same time, it's a good way for these colors to get card advantage without trading life for it. Our discard package is fueled by Faithless Looting, which costs 1 red for a sorcery that draws 2 cards and causes you to discard 2 cards. You can also flash it back out of your graveyard by paying 2 and a red and exiling it. Faithless Looting isn't strictly card advantage, which means you see as many cards as you get from Faithless Looting once you flashed it back. The way you can get a little bit of extra value out of Faithless Looting and turn it into somewhat of a card advantage spell is by using some graveyard synergies like the one that exists on our next spell, Bump in the Night. Bump in the Night costs 1 black for a sorcery that causes target opponent to lose 3 life, but you can cast Bump in the Night again out of your graveyard by paying 5 and a red and exiling it. The bit of extra life gain and card filtering of available to this black-red burn deck means that we might survive into a later game than a traditional burn deck would. That means Bump in the Night can occasionally be a 6 damage burn spell that just costs a little bit more mana. The other spell providing us Faithless Looting value is Alms of the Vein, which costs 2 and a black and causes target opponent to lose 3 life and allows you to gain 3 life. The real synergy between Alms of the Vein and Faithless Looting, though, comes from its Madness ability, which allows you to pay 1 black to cast it as you're discarding it. Our last non-land cards aren't burn spells, but they do a fantastic job of pressuring your opponent's life total anyway. Those non-land cards are 2 copies of Gurmag Angler. Gurmag Angler costs 6 and a black for a 5/5 zombie fish with Delve, which means each card you exile from your graveyard while casting this spell pays for 1 of the generic mana in its mana cost. We're going to be flying through our hand, throwing cheap burn spells at our opponent and filtering with Faithless Looting, so it's not inconceivable for us to hit an early Gurmag Angler and start killing our opponent before they have a chance to react to it. Alright, let's talk about this mana base. It's nice and simple. For our mana fixing, we have 4 copies of Bloodfell Caves, standard Pauper duels. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you gain 1 life, and when they become untapped, they add black and red. The only other duels we're running are Rakdos Carnariums, your black and red Karus, which means they enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you return a land you control to your hand. When they're untapped, you can tap them for black and red. For our basics, we have 6 basic mountains and 5 basic swamps. Lots of untapped mana so that we can start clocking our opponent with burn spells as soon as the first turn of the game. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. It's pretty simple. We've got 4 copies of Chainer's Edict and 3 copies of Geth's Verdict for a ton of sacrifice effects just in case our opponent is on a strategy that's weak to that sort of thing, which is pretty much any strategy with creatures. We have a ton of Blazing Volleys for dealing 1 damage to all of our opponent's X1s, and we have 4 copies of Soul Reap for killing our opponent's green creatures and losing them a bit of extra life in the process. And there it is, Black-Red Burn by Tominous featuring Soverign's Bite. We're going to be taking this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince at 7 p.m. Atlantic time this Tuesday night. We're there every Tuesday night playing Possibly Pauper Playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.